Hey everyone, we are finally starting a new book because we have to get through a lot of stuff. Anyway, I've been really wanting to cover this book because this covers Georgia Tann. If you don't know who Georgia Tann, she is a woman who ran a home for unwed mothers in Tennessee and I believe also Mississippi. She is the very reason why adoption here in the United States has been profited. Oh my gosh, I cannot speak today. Anyway, she's the reason that it was a black market. She was human trafficking these babies. She was telling the birth moms that the baby died, and then she was selling them out the back door to hopeful adoptive families. And then they were telling the birth parent or the adoptive parent that the mother died. Whew. Yeah. This was called the baby scoop era. Really bad. We are going to eventually read other books, more fictional towards this, I will say. But if you want more firsthand accounts from those birth moms, I do have up The Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler. So keep that in mind. Now, before we get started into this book, I do want to make a note. I think these two things are very, very important. Number one, this book was sold to Octavia Spencer, the rights to create a movie. We do not have the movie out yet. I am really hoping that she does put the movie out. I'm really excited. I absolutely love Octavia Spencer. And I think this will be a fantastic way to continue to speak about things. The second thing I want to note, okay, is that Barbara Baisantz Raymond is not an adoptee. She is not a psychologist either. She is an adoptive parent, and she co-authored this book with the Adoption Network. So I do kind of have mixed feelings about that. I'm taking things with a grain of salt. However, with that being said, this book has come highly recommended, and I was reading things on the Adoption Network and why they were discussing things and why they wanted to change things. So, with that being said, we are going to start with our prologue. I am so sorry for a long intro, but let's dive right in. Okay. I learned of Georgia Tann in 1990 from Alma Sipple, who'd met her decades earlier. I was interviewing Alma for a magazine piece. She said she could still see Georgia, a stern-looking woman with close cropped hair, round wireless glasses, and an air of utter authority. She gained entry to Alma's apartment in Memphis, Tennessee, by identifying herself as a social worker and orphanage director, concerned about Alma's 10-month-old daughter, who had a cold. After examining Irma, Georgia pronounced her seriously ill. First of all, as far as we know, I'm going to have to do more digging. I don't believe that Georgia Tann was a social worker. And for what we know about her, she's a very bad person. Second of all, while there are definitely times where you can tell if a child is sick, I really think it's in the best interest that you, if you are, social worker and say like a CPS moment, where you say, hey, we're going to go to the hospital, or hey, let's get this child to the doctor, and go from there, right? Number one, you cannot legally enter someone's home without their permission. That's number one, right? Like, that is against the law. That is trespassing. Number two, what we know of Georgia is she prayed. Again, I'm going to use the pray as in Preyed. And I say this very specifically, right? On unwed mothers. okay? So keep all of this in mind when we are talking about not only this book, but about adoption and how the system really works. Okay. When Alma said she had no money for a doctor, Georgia offered to obtain free treatment by passing Irma off as her ward. She warned Alma not to accompany her daughter to the hospital. If the nurses know you're her mother, they'll charge you, she said. 2 days later, she told Alma that her baby had died. See, she's lying, right? Like, how I just, maybe because I'm a better person than her, right? I mean, I think most people are better people than Georgia Tan, but how do you have no empathy, right? And it is strictly because she just wanted the cha-ching, right? She just wanted to sell the children. She did not care about the best interest of the child. So anytime I hear governments or, CPS, all that say, well, it's in the best interest of the child, and I'm looking at them like, you do know that the laws really don't reflect that, right? Because of this particular woman. Anyway, Alma didn't believe her, but neither frantic visits to George's orphanage, from which she was ejected, nor desperate trips to the police station where she was ignored, nor haunting of hospitals and graveyards revealed the truth that Georgia had flown Irma to an adoptive home in Ohio. When I interviewed Alma 45 years later, she finally found her daughter. But while the reunion had been happy, their relationship was fragile. Irma was uncomfortable with the television coverage of the reunion that Alma had sought, and educated enough to intimidate a mother who'd only finished 6th grade. What can I get her for Christmas? Alma asked me. I'm afraid to insult her with my taste. A year later, Alma had a heart attack and called me from the hospital. She and her daughter were not in touch. Only someone who's lost a child this way can know how horrible it is, Alma said, crying. There's a hole in me that will never be filled. So, we're hearing from the birth mother's perspective right now, right? Just in this prologue. And I want to say it's not only did she have the loss through adoption, which she didn't know that if her baby was really dead or not, right? But it's another loss because of the reunion, and she doesn't have contact with her biological child. And we have to remember that it's grieving a living loss, right? Not just for the birth parent, but also for the adoptee. So when we read things like this, when we talk about people's stories, while some people have a better experience, majority do not, right? And I want people to remember that as I read these books, and I take from different people's perspectives, right? We take from different people's stories. The important person in all of this will always be the adoptee. The adoptee's voice will always be important, okay? So Irma, Alma's child here, her voice is the most important. And if she did not feel comfortable continuing the reunion, then we have to respect that. Alma has to respect that. As hard as that is, we have to remember that Irma was an adoptee. She was stolen, literally, but she had no voice, right? And even though she might have a voice now, per the book, is complex. I couldn't forget the woman who had ruined Alma's life and so many others. Georgia had arranged over 5,000 adoptions between 1924 and 1950, many involving children she had kidnapped. She had also, let's give a trigger warning, molested some of the little girls in her care and placed some children with pedophiles. Georgia had caused so many child deaths that by the 1930s, official infant mortality rate in Memphis was the highest in the country. And the actual number of Memphis children who died was even larger than the official count because Georgia failed to report many deaths. She also neglected to bury all of her dead children in the cemetery used by her adoption agency. They simply disappeared, a former Memphian told me. Still, most of Georgia's children survived and grew up all across the country, many in her favorite markets like Los Angeles and New York. Those adopted by Joan Crawford, June Allison, and Dick Powell, and other celebrities were featured in magazines, and some have had distinguished careers, but most seemingly ordinary people coping with the extraordinary fact of having been placed with adoptive parents unscreened for anything but wealth. Okay, I want to stop here for a moment. There is a book called Mommy Dearest by Christina Crawford. I believe it's by Christina Crawford. It is by one of Joan Crawford's adopted children. She had 4. And it is very complex. I don't know if you guys really want to read it. Yes, the movie is based off of it, and then there's a lot to it. At least as of right now, I have other books that I want to get through first, but this is the thing, right? They don't care about anything but the money. They don't care. They still use children as a quote-unquote family building tool instead of what is the best interest of the child. And no, wealth does not have the best interest of the child. You can be in poverty and still be a great mom. You can struggle and be a great parent, right? Does poverty play a huge role in, lack of resources? Of course. And I think that we should absolutely give resources. However, do I think children should be removed due to poverty? No. I've heard of some of the most wealthiest families being some of the most abusive, right? Being involved in alcohol and drug, and we're talking about the Epstein files in the news more recently, and here we see just that. We also have Diddy and his freak offs, right? There was drugs involved. Wealth does not mean you are a good person, and you can become impoverished at any given moment. Let's remember that. There is so much more to being a good parent. And while, yes, biologically, we are safer with our biological mother and father, and at higher risks when we are not with them, does that make all biological families safe? Of course not, right? So, yes, safe external care is going to be necessary at times, but we are specifically talking about a time when our society deemed anyone that was unwed and pregnant a bad person. They shamed unwed mothers, only unwed mothers. They never shamed the fathers, by the way. You could be a single father and be living, and you're seen as a hero. But if you're an unwed mother and trying to raise your child, oh my gosh, like everything was against you. And this also played into the resources you had with education, with career, with how your family saw you. And so a lot of the times it was seen as, or the birth mom was outcasted. She was forced into a home for unwed mothers, right, where the parents would pay part of it until the child was adopted out. Like I said, go back to the girls who were sent away, or the girls who went away by Ann Fessler. We have it on this YouTube channel, where it talks about all this, right? It talks about the history of these homes. So I just want you guys to remember that this was all happening during that time. I also want to mention, I'm reading this in 2025 going into 2026. These homes still exist. Now, they are for religious purposes, like Mormons, LDS, all of that. So it's not as common. However, they still exist. And the impact that Georgia Tan had on the industry and the laws are still very much in place. Okay, continuing on. Some of these adoptive parents loved their new children and treated them well, but other children were made to serve as domestics and farmhands. Some were starved, beaten with hoes and razor strops, hung from hooks and graped. There seemed no bottom to the pain Georgia had caused, and I flew to Memphis, consumed by questions, and besides the questions about her and the consequences of her actions, there was another one. Why hadn't anyone stopped her? She had been expelled from Mississippi before moving to Tennessee. So in Mississippi, she also ran home for unwed mothers. What had made Memphis ripe for her? And what aspects of her era had facilitated her crimes? Only after situating Georgia within her context would I discover her other dimension, the one that allowed her to hurt millions more people than those she directly touched. While building her black market business, she invented modern American adoption. It's hard to overestimate her influence when she began her work in Tennessee in the 1920s. Adoption as we know it did not exist. Eugenicists had made Americans afraid to adopt, and agencies like the Boston Children's Aid Society were arranging a scant 5 adoptions a year in 1928. However, only 4 years after Georgia's arrival in Memphis, she arranged 206. She did much more than popularize adoption. She commercialized it, charging adoptive parents large fees and marketing children in nationally syndicated newspaper ads. Worse, she stole adoptees' identities to cover her kidnapping crimes and to appease clients threatened by the possibility of their new children someday reuniting with their birth parents. She falsified adoptees' birth certificates, sending their true documents and issuing them false certificates, portraying their adoptive parents as birth parents. Okay, pausing there. Again, we are over 100 at this point. We're at 101 years after she had even begun, right? 101 years of falsified birth certificates for adoptees. 101 years of this. We still have not changed it. Even with open adoptions, even when you have access to your birth certificate, which will go state by state, but many do not even have access. Our birth certificates change, so it looks like our adoptive parents gave birth to us, right? Even my adoption. I have my original only because my parents kept it, and I was born in a state where it was open, we can access it. I also live in a state where it's open, which is great, but, and that's only for the birth certificate, by the way. That's not open for every information that you need, so just a side note. But my birth certificate still says my adoptive parents biologically gave birth to me. There are people who, or adoptees, I should say, whose names changed, right? Whose the birth date changes, the location changes, so you don't even have all your full accurate information, or it gets blacked out and you can't access it. This creates such an identity issue and creates such inauthenticity for adoptees. And I want to make this clear. Again, 101 years of this, and we still have not done better. We know about Georgia Tan. Georgia Tan wasn't doing this on her own. She had doctors. She had congressmen, senators. She had people in her back pocket to create laws to protect her. And we still haven't changed it. Do you guys see how problematic this is? 101 years of her influence has continued. Okay, I rest my case. We're going to continue on with the prologue. The practice was approved by legislators who believed it would spare adoptees the onus of illegitimacy. All 50 states ultimately falsified birth certificates, and still do. Georgia's legacy has endured the 21st century, and the vast majority of America's 6 million adoptees are still legally denied knowledge of their roots, even after they become adults. Many can't find their birth parents or learn potentially life-saving information about family health histories. But finally, 57 years after Georgia's death in 1950, adoptees are escaping her influence. In a dramatic legislative and court victory in 1999, people who had been adopted in Tennessee won access to their original birth certificates and adoption records. Since the passage of the Tennessee Open Adoption Records Law, adoptees have won similar legal battles in 12 other states. It's now more in 2025 since this has been written. I just want to note that. They won't stop until Georgia's legacy is eradicated throughout the nation. Georgia accomplished all of that her victims are fighting to undo through boldness, cunning, and the exploitation of her time and place. I began my search by studying the environment in which she had operated, paying a visit to the site of her orphanage on Poplar Avenue. All right, that is the end of the prologue. Again, I just want to remind you guys, this is written by an adoptive parent who works really closely with the Adoption Network, but she's also an award-winning journalist for several magazines, and this book the rights have been bought by Octavia Spencer. So I'm hoping we go into this with less of a adoptive parent point of view and more of a historical point of view, less bias on the adoptive parent part. No, there are some amazing adoptive parents out there. I will say this. Even though you guys were also preyed upon by the adoption agencies due to usually fertility issues, right? I want to say this. There are some amazing adoptive parents who have done everything to actually do the best interest of the child, right? I'm not saying that you didn't also play into the system, because yes, and it gets more complicated when we talk about foster care to adopt. It's not a one-size-fits-all, or less so of a one-size-fits-all in terms of when we're talking foster care to adopt versus private infant adoption. But the adoptive parents that I know that I will say that are, I'm going to say amazing, right? In terms, they understand the difference between raising a biological child's needs versus an adoptive parent, an adoptee. They understand that open adoptions are key and will keep it open and listen to the adoptee. They will seek resources. They will seek therapy. They will read the books. They will listen to the adoptees. They will go to they'll go to talks, conferences, all of this stuff, right? They'll have the discussions. They are the ones who not only sought therapy for themselves with the fertility issue, but also sought therapy for the adoptee, right? They're the ones that will fully embrace the child's culture and understanding and not gaslight or negate or lie and try to make things inauthentic. They try to give as much information and try to be as supportive as possible. And we need more of that if you are going to be an adoptive parent. Now, I would love to be able to say, hey, no more adoptions exist, right? It's a completely different legal process. But that's not the reality of it, right? So I'm hoping that if you're an adoptive parent, you are here because you want to learn and you want to listen and you want to do better. And by doing better, part of it is knowing the history of adoption. Part of it is knowing the history of foster care and moving forward so we don't go back. We don't have history repeat itself. Excuse me. Now, I do want to make note that when this was all starting, while the Civil War had ended, right, so the end of slavery, Juneteenth, that was specific to a place in Texas, but what started after the end of Civil War became the orphan trains. It really became the beginning of the targeted Black and brown children, specifically from the North, to be shipped down south to be quote-unquote adopted or quote-unquote fostered on these farms and work them to death. Okay? So when we say that there's human trafficking in adoption and foster care, this stuff still continues. We still see families do just this. And I was just talking to my therapist about, working on a farm as a child and how, depending on the parent, how abusive that can be, right? Now, my parents were not abusive about it. I had my small chores. Nobody worked me to death. We made sure I was cool. If I wasn't feeling well, I didn't have to do it. I loved doing it. It was my choice, so forth. I'm not, baling or, throwing bales of hay in 90-degree weather, which she was saying that she had a friend that had to do that, right? There is a very fine line with child labor laws and family business, especially farms, right? But just because you have a farm doesn't mean, or a family business, doesn't mean that your adoptee should be forced to do that type of labor. There's one thing to understand chores and help while also putting their needs first, right? Now, that's not to say the horses or cows shouldn't get fed or milked or, you know what I'm saying? Like, yes, can the bales of hay wait, a day or two, or do it later in the afternoon and you take a couple extra days? Fine. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just, there's just bits and pieces of it, right? Or can you get, adults to come help you? That's what we used to do. We used to have, we called it hay day. And it would be, usually it was one day, sometimes two, where we'd go to my uncle's farm and we'd go out haying and we'd have to, bale the hay and all that. And we'd have a chicken and rib dinner. Oh my God, it was so good. I'd usually be like over by the deck or in the kitchen, helping with that. They had goats they also had goats and they had cows at the time. This was at the time. But if I wanted to be in the field with the guys, I could be. I'd be playing soccer with my cousins sometimes. We haven't done that in quite a while, but, it was a choice, right? It wasn't like I was forced into this hot weather to go do that. And that's what's important. Now, growing up on the farm, I also had access to, fresh stream. We would jump in, we'd have fun. We had to kind of explain the way that the family farm is that we're the original houses, which is my other neighbor. So my uncle lives in, this is confusing. I have many uncles, but we're my aunt and uncle who live on our road. They live in the second farmhouse. The original farmhouse is a different neighbor, and part of the land was sold. But there was a little pond. I learned to go fishing, and then we're going to call him Rob. Rob created a bigger pond. It's now a swimming pond. We were just over there, and you can have fun, you can fish, anyway. we always had access to that. I still have access to that, right? But we have access to hang out. We would go up to the quarry and you know, check it out, look at fossils and stuff. We were allowed to go have fun, right? It wasn't like, oh my gosh, you have to be stuck and do X, Y, and Z, right? We were also encouraged to go to camp, right? All of us went to sleepaway camp. My uncle would joke, hey, if you ever want to run away from sleepaway camp, all you have to do is go down to the rope. This is where the original ropes course was. Go down to the original ropes course, go down, cross the river, and then it's pretty much a straight shot from there, and it's like 4 miles, 4 mile walk. Granted, we're going up and down mountains, okay? So you have to remember all of that, but that was his introduction to me to sleepaway camp. Like, hey, if you ever want to escape, here's a way. But, you know, we had fun, you know, and a lot of us kids that went to that camp were farmers' kids, right? Or grew up on farms, or grew up next to farms. You know, I'm completely surrounded. I grew up with horses. I grew up with cows, and, you know, we had pigs at one point. We had dairy cows. Now we have beef cows. There's a horse farm down the road. There's sheep down the road. There's a buffalo farm that's a couple miles away that we check out. So there's, you know, we are just surrounded by opportunities, right? But remember, I'm adopted. So, you know, people assume that just because you're adopted, you're going to get a better life. You're going to be, you know, adopted by Daddy Warbucks. No, the majority who adopt are middle to upper class. Yes. But had I lived with either of my biological parents, I would have still been on a farm. Like, I still would have had horses. That's what's funny. It's just in a different state, you know. Yes, my parents are also older. Yes, my parents are together. That's the difference, you know. So people assume things like, oh, you're going to have a better life. No, it's just a different life. Anyway, I am going off on a tangent here, but I just want people to remember that, you know, that's really the truth about adoption. I'll see you guys tomorrow for the next part of this book called George's Home.